Hello, I'm Emma Belsky. From 2021 to 2022, while I was a student at Mount St. Mary's University, I interviewed several professors about texts that they loved teaching and reading. I'm happy to share these recordings with you now as the Grade 8 podcast. Enjoy!
Welcome back to the Grade 8 podcast. This is Emma Weinheimer, and today Dr. Hochschild and I are going to be interviewing Dr. Chris Anadale, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Mount St. Mary's University. Welcome to both of you.
Always good to be here, Emma.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Anadale, before we get into Twilight of the Idols by Friedrich Nietzsche, can you tell us a little bit about your academic background and maybe your interest in Nietzsche himself?
Oh, goodness. Well, my interest is in many ways the interest of a teacher, because I teach modern philosophy here at the Mount every year and have done for quite a while. I teach it as an advanced level elective, and it enrolls a lot of seminarians because of the seminary curriculum requirements. And Nietzsche is a pretty common part of that course as the way I teach it. I stretch the definition of modern philosophy a little bit beyond the 17th and 18th centuries to include late scholasticism and Occam at one end, and to include Nietzsche most years at the other end. Sometimes I end the course with Kierkegaard, but usually I end it with Nietzsche. And so that's part of my interest in this, is that I teach modern philosophy quite a lot at both a basic and an advanced level. And I don't think you can understand modernity without really understanding how it leads up to and makes possible some of the themes in Nietzsche's thought.
Thank you.
Do you want to say any about just sort of your background and other interests in philosophy and how Nietzsche does or doesn't fit in with that? Or we're interviewing different faculty members in this podcast, and they're not usually talking about their main academic specialty. We ask them to talk about just a book that interests them. So do you want to give any sort of background other than Nietzsche?
Sure. No. Well, I did my graduate study at Emory University in Atlanta in the late 90s and early 2000s. And that Emory at the time had a very strong history of philosophy focus in their philosophy program. So I had a lot of exposure to and sort of deep love of the history of philosophy, and wrote my dissertation on 19th century Catholic liberalism, on the thought of Lord Acton. And that's an entire time period, same time period in which Nietzsche is living and writing, the late 19th century, a period of great tumult and change in the intellectual life and in European politics. So I'd say that's part of the interest for me is being part of that period of philosophical history. I'd say also part of it is the fact that I've been teaching in seminary now for 15 years. I've been teaching Catholic seminarians, both here at the Mount and at other institutions. And Nietzsche seems to me to present a real, genuine challenge to most of our received assumptions, both about modernity and about problems with modernity. And so I think he's a necessary figure to think about. But here I've turned around and started talking about Nietzsche again instead of talking about my background.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, it shows how your background connects you to Nietzsche. And let's jump in and talk about the book. Maybe we usually ask to start off with just some historical background. Assume listeners don't know anything about Nietzsche, or they just have some vague impression. What kind of groundwork should they have before approaching this text?
Oh boy. Well, it helps to know, of course, who Nietzsche was. Nietzsche, an important but in his own time obscure German writer of the 1870s and 1880s, died in 1900, went insane in 1889. He wrote in this final year of his life, final year of his sanity in 1888, he wrote 5 books. And Twilight of the Idols was the second of them. So if people are aware of Nietzsche, I think usually through his cultural influence and through, maybe I should say, the cultural appropriation of him by Hollywood studios and the like. There's a video, I think, that the web magazine Slate did about how Hollywood gets Nietzsche wrong. And sure. It looks at different quotes from what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. The way in which Nietzsche is sort of appropriated and misappropriated for kind of shallow substitute for character development for villains in popular movies. So that's part of what it is. But most people, I think, who know anything of Nietzsche have heard of Will to Power, and that's one of his central ideas that I think can be understood and misunderstood by a careful reading of him.
What are some of the cultural forces that Nietzsche is responding to, if we're going to appreciate his work? What is he noticing in the middle of the 19th century that provokes some of his thought?
Well, I can think of two right off the top of my head. One of them is, of course, what he calls the death of God in the Gay Science, which is a sort of elaborate mythological expression for some observations about the decline of religion and the sort of coming apart of the entire Christian worldview, which was assumed to be, if not stable, at least enduring through the 18th and 19th centuries, and which I think Nietzsche comes along to point out has become hollow and enervated and has really lost its hold on people. It's not nearly so strong. It's one of the hollow idols that he refers to at the beginning of Twilight of the Idols. The other, I suppose, I'd say would be the dominance of Hegelian philosophy in the first half of the 19th century. After Kant and Hegel, 1790s to the 1830s, you get this big, how shall I put it? You get a tremendous surge of systematic philosophy and of systematizers, and then you have the pendulum swinging in the opposite direction, away from this sort of comprehensive systematic philosophy, away from reason with a capital R. You have a number of other forces that feed into that, Romanticism, mid-century revolution, and the like. But I think that's the background against which Nietzsche's writing. I would associate him with figures like Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard, who at his same time or slightly earlier are emphasizing the value of the individual in culture and in history at the expense of these kind of sweeping, grand movements of historical forces.
All right, well, I think that segues us pretty nicely into talking about the content of the text. I've never read this myself. I know we looked a little bit at the Gay Science and Thus Spake Zarathustra in the Phil 203 class, the Foundations of Modern Philosophy or something like that. Like our core philosophy class.
Yeah, the second of the two core philosophy classes.
Yeah, so we briefly touched on Nietzsche, but I've never read this, so let's get cracking. Can you give a brief-ish summary of the content? Like what does he cover? Just like different sections.
I can talk about some different sections. It's
right.
tough with many of Nietzsche's works to describe them as a kind of unity with.
Does it have a structure?
Does it have a structure?
Do any of his works have a structure?
Well,
I don't know. I haven't read enough to know that.
No, it's interesting. Actually, I was just looking at it before we started here, and apparently Nietzsche's original title was to be a philosopher's idleness, or a psychologist's idleness. It was supposed to have and he gave it this more dramatic title, Twilight of the Idols. The subtitle, how to philosophize with a hammer. So it's got this kind of grandiose, almost excessive, swaggering title. I've already mentioned it was one of Nietzsche's 5 final books, and I think the one that maybe is the best introduction to his work. It's the product of, as far as his thought got, so in early 1888. This seems to summarize most of his major themes. So he discusses, early in the book, he discusses Socrates and his critique of Socrates and this Platonic idea of reason. So we have this idea of, I think, Nietzsche as presenting a kind of choice between himself and the ancients, as a kind of Nietzsche versus Plato, or as people who've read MacIntyre know, Nietzsche versus Aristotle. It's one or the other world pictures that's going to dominate in the future. He says quite a bit more about people in his own times. He's got these sort of periodic interludes where he'll just give you an entire 10 pages of very brief 2-line aphorisms, almost a sort of tweet storm, right in the middle of the book. And I think that's intended in some ways to kind of break up the overall flow of the book and to give you an idea of it being kind of episodic. He talks about the character of modern education, of Germans. He doesn't approve of German culture and German politics of his own time. And we get in here a critique of a lot of what's going on in modern philosophy, modern ideas of reason and objectivity. And I was wondering just exactly how he wraps this up with a bunch of psychological observations about the nature of modern culture as opposed to the nature of, say, Greek culture, heroic Greek culture and the like.
Could you give some examples of some of the things that he pointed out?
He's got quite a lot in here. One of the sections I was thinking about just before we started here, about in the middle of the book, called What the Germans Lack. He's critiquing the Germans. this is maybe a helpful perspective if you think of Nietzsche as a sort of proto-Nazi, as the sort of representing the worst of the Germans. There's a lot that's bad in Nietzsche, but I think it's wrong to associate him with the kind of over-the-top German patriotism and nationalism and jingoism of the 1920s and 30s. What the Germans lack, Nietzsche says in this middle section, is really proper kind of education and spirit. And so he has this very almost fiery critique of the German university system, which is rising and systematizing at that time, and which in many ways is the envy of the world. I mean, it's the model along which American universities and many other countries remodeled themselves. Nietzsche has very little good to say about it, and he thinks that it's leading to a deterioration of true culture.
So I want to surface something that I think is kind of in the background that some listeners might wonder about. I mean, you've mentioned association with the Nazis or Hollywood's use of Nietzsche to characterize villains. And he certainly has a reputation for being a severe critic of Christianity. And yet it sounds like you're treating him with a great deal of respect and maybe even find wisdom in what he's doing. Am I hearing ambivalence? Am I hearing a kind of subversive, there's a lot more valuable here than people realize? Like, let's get this out on the table and talk about, especially, in the context of a Catholic university, why should Christians read Nietzsche?
No, that's a fantastic question. It's maybe the question with which I should have begun. I would say, just to approach the question directly and to answer it before I forget, people should read Nietzsche, Christians especially should read Nietzsche, because he's got something important to say. Not necessarily has something true to say, but he has something important to say, and I think we ignore it at our peril. And one of the things I say to my students, among them some seminarians, is if Nietzsche's right about anything, we need to discover it, just because we have an obligation to learn the truth. But if Nietzsche's wrong, we need to consider him seriously enough to discover just how he's wrong and to be able to speak about it. I don't think he's one of those thinkers that you can just put your hand up and just ignore or wave away. So, oh, he was a madman, he went insane. Or, oh, he's caught it deep in some personal vice. Okay? The tendency to personalize and sort of critique the character of a thinker instead of his thought and the quality of the thought, I think is an intellectual vice. It's one that we should avoid. But I think it's one that's especially hazardous for confronting Nietzsche, whose thought I think really does contain a fairly profound critique of modernity, the state of modernity and some of its assumptions, and it in a way that's combined with a number of very troubling and even truly wicked prescriptions, or a sort of positive case. So one initial take on Nietzsche is that you can read him enough to understand both his critique and his prescription, both his attack on modernity and his alternative to modernity, and you might accept elements of the first without agreeing with any elements of the second. I think the other reason to read Nietzsche is because he's profoundly subtle and ironic. He is a very careful thinker, and if one reads him shallowly, you say, what is this garbage, right? What is this trash? But I think if you begin to see him with the right sort of attitude, I'm not talking about being sort of converted to his side or reading him sympathetically, but I think if you become aware of the intricacies of his thought, you are able to, I think, appreciate the sort of multi-layers that he's going with. I mean, Nietzsche is one of those thinkers who has thought through the way he's presenting himself and the way he's expecting you to react to how he's thinking. So certainly early on when you're reading him, one of your first reactions will be to recognize that he's directing you into certain channels of thoughts and assumptions and conclusions. And once you begin to see that, I think you begin to appreciate the layers in his thought. And I hope I'm not sounding too abstruse here, but I think we underestimate him at our peril, and we risk putting ourselves in a situation not to be able to refute somebody fairly intelligent and sophisticated who comes along who wants to agree with Nietzsche on some key points.
Yeah, I mean, speaking from my own experience, and I don't know the text that you're talking about, but read large sections of Beyond Good and Evil with students in that same core class, and it also is kind of aphoristic. There's a chapter structure, but you get the sense that it's just a list of themes so that he can organize his aphorisms. You can jump around. And I mean, really the only way to teach Nietzsche is to read some of those aphorisms out loud and make students think about, like, so is he right? Or do you feel insulted? And if so, why? And he's trying to get under your skin. He's also, although a severe critic of Christianity, he has this very strange admiration and respect for Christianity. He reserves his greatest disdain for what you're calling modernity.
Right.
And it's hard to, we should maybe talk about what even that is. It's post-Christian, and that's what he's really, he blames Christians for leading us there. But yeah, you really can't just sort of put an argument on the board and say, can we follow the argument? You have to get inside his head. And it's a very strange thing about reading him.
It is. I mean, it's a unique style. It's unlike any kind of book you read previously, certainly in a modern philosophy course. But there's also a way, there's a point at which you arrive in the study of Nietzsche, or just reading him with an open mind. You come to the point of thinking, I think he might be right, but I wish he weren't. Right. And that's the point at which you really need to begin, I think, a careful philosophical study. So his work doesn't give up its secrets easily. And I think it's capable. He's got this kind of dramatic flair, this ironic flair, kind of like Plato in some regards, stylistically, that you have to be patient, and you have to be willing to go through not just what's on the surface in his arguments, but also what else is going on in the overall structure of what he's trying to give you. So in that way, he's helpful to think through these problems with, even if one comes from and ends up at a profoundly different point of view than his own.
So it seems like if nothing else, Nietzsche, like we can benefit from reading Nietzsche just to challenge our own beliefs and to essentially like force our brains to work and give ourselves like that really annoying but very cathartic philosophy headache that I had 2 days ago.
Yes, he's a good source of the philosophy headache. I agree.
Yes, but yeah, definitely, I'm with you on the from what I did read, it was very, very complicated, and like Dr. Hochschild said, it wasn't just as simple as, okay, have we killed God? What does that mean? Like, you have to talk about, like, what does each word mean? What did he mean? What does his character mean? What does that mean for us? And if you wish he wasn't right, then why? So I really enjoyed reading him because it forced us to open up a lot of other questions in ways that Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas didn't necessarily do that.
Right. Well, even an interesting side question can be, why does Nietzsche write in this way? If it's not just a personal quirk, if we see something similar in other thinkers of the mid and late 19th century, has the project of philosophy by this point come to a stage where some people have recognized this is actually the best way to begin writing and presenting things, this dramatic structure, this strange, ironic, sort of subverting, multi-layer work. It's enticing.
Yeah. So you mentioned that Christianity is one of the idols that he talks about in the beginning of the book. Can you maybe talk a little bit about some of the idols that he calls out and critiques? Not necessarily just Christianity, but like, what does he talk about as he's like setting it up?
Good question. It's a book's called Twilight of the Idols. I don't know that there's a.
Also, we were talking actually earlier today, and you said like the title Twilight of the Idols is a sort of poke at a previous author and his book. What was that?
Well, it's not so much a book; it's a work of music.
Okay.
So Nietzsche, early in his career, is associated with Richard Wagner, the composer.
Yes.
He was a big Wagner fan early in his career, almost embarrassingly so. A stan, the kids might say today. He broke with Wagner. In fact, 2 of his last 5 books in that final year of 1888, 2 of them are devoted to attacking Wagner. Mm-hmm. So the reasons for that, somewhat complicated. We don't have to get into it. But Wagner has a piece of music called Twilight of the Gods.
That's it, yes.
And Nietzsche has now titled his book Twilight of the Idols. I think I don't know if it's a poke necessarily or if it's just a sort of ironic reference, but it's also a callback to Bacon. If you remember, Francis Bacon talks about the idols of the tribe and idols of the marketplace and different idols which get in the way of understanding of the world. I think Nietzsche's intending this to also call to mind that kind of critique, that there are things out there that are just getting in the way of our being able to understand what's going on And so part of what he's critiquing with critiquing Christianity, critiquing modernism, is an attack on the idols of his age, which he thinks are hollow and in need of being destroyed or replaced.
We're talking about Nietzsche as a philosopher, but also as a peculiar philosopher, and the conversation has connected him with other sort of modes of thinking and writing. So yes, he has an artistic sensibility. You're describing the sort of literary sophistication of what he's written. You mentioned an association with sort of psychology. So he's kind of trying to figure out what makes human beings tick. And you also associated him with the existentialist movement. And that's where I first read Nietzsche in college, was in class on existentialism. He's kind of all over the place. Mm-hmm. And it makes me wonder, too, could we think of him as a spiritual writer?
Now, what do you mean by that?
Well, I'll let you interpret it however you want. But, I mean, you're not going to find him in the spirituality section of Barnes & Noble if that kind of place still exists. But does he even want to count as a philosopher, or is he trying to do something different?
That's a great question. I wonder. I was thinking, you're sort of listing the number of different areas that Nietzsche sort of has a finger in or is going off in. That can be a mark of, sort of dissolution, but can also be a mark of genius. He's managed to launch and be relevant to so many different areas, so many different fields. Often he describes himself as a psychologist, and I don't know the resonance of the particular German terms that he's using. I was thinking of the subtitle of Walter Kaufmann's intellectual biography of Nietzsche. It's called Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist. Okay, and there's a pretty wide range of areas in which he's taking an interest. Also a wide range of you might say roles that he ironically or semi-ironically assumes. Right, he's a polemicist against Christianity. He's a very acute, I think, psychological observer, and I think one of the things that really is valuable and perhaps even true in Nietzsche are some of his psychological observations about human motivation. And in a lot of important ways, he sort of prefigures and paves the way for Freud. If you're being uncharitable, you can say Freud steals a lot of Nietzsche's best stuff and presents it himself in the early 20th century, because Nietzsche goes insane and dies young. But is he a philosopher? Part of what's happening is that I think the entire notion of what it means to be a philosopher is changing. Nietzsche is one of these figures that is studied so much because he's studied from so many different perspectives. When I took a graduate seminar on Nietzsche, it was in a philosophy program, but we had, I think, the entire comparative literature grad student coterie taking the course at the same time, and people from women's studies and people from elsewhere. So he's a figure with a wide appeal because of going off in so many directions. But I think, part of what's happening by, the late 19th century is we're not entirely certain just what it means to do philosophy any longer and to be a philosopher. The very nature of the philosophical act, we might say, is now kind of up for grabs. And so when Nietzsche says, Socrates is a symbol of decadence in the Greek mind, that the fact that Socrates comes along is not the beginning of the Greek, sort of renaissance of the Greek intellect and spirit. It's a sign that the Greeks have turned away from sort of heroic action, and now they've all become, Socrates is the best that's left. He's just the guy who's able to sort of ply his trade, like a vulture or a parasite that appears, at the end of the lifespan of something great. That's radical and new, and you might say it's almost perverse, certainly from the perspective of an entire philosophical tradition sort of flowing on from Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But what, again, so beneath the layer of irony, what does it mean to do philosophy now? What does it mean to get back behind Plato to Heraclitus? In some ways here, Heidegger, is asking the same questions, right, most of a century later.
Earlier you mentioned modernity and Nietzsche's critique of modernity. And I don't know if I'm going to put you on the spot and try to define that, but today people sometimes talk about postmodernity, and usually a genealogy of postmodernity would trace it back to Nietzsche. That's part of the reason that he's been so influential, not just in philosophy departments, but say in literature departments and other departments that where you'd find something that would be talked about as postmodernity. Mm-hmm. Is it easier for us to approach modernity by asking what postmodernity is? What is postmodernity?
Oh boy. I was going to say, Emma, what do you say postmodernity is?
I don't know. I'm a philosophy minor.
It's funny you should ask this, because one of the questions I'll sometimes pose to my modern philosophy classes is Nietzsche the last of the modern philosophers? That is, does he bring modernity to its sort of logical, if maybe also ironic and self-destructive conclusion, or is he the first of the postmodern philosophers? That is, does he take the measure of modernity and decide to destroy it and begin something new? And that's an interesting essay prompt, because you have to think through, well, what's the relation between modernity and postmodernity?
Well,
what do I mean by postmodern?
If he is the end of modernity, then that would make him exactly what he talked about Socrates then, except more intentional, I guess.
Except he's defeating reason here instead of giving birth to reason.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, maybe you might almost think of him as kind of the anti-Socrates. He's reversing the historical order. If Socrates marks the change from a sort of heroic, manly culture of Achilles and Homeric heroes who act and don't think, and Socrates is the triumph of the sort of the dialectic and the reason and speech. Socrates with his words. You even see the frustration of this in Apology. There's it's all words, Socrates. It's not action. Nietzsche maybe is reversing this and says, that modernity has talked itself into such an exhausted stupor that it's time to prophesy the coming of the Overman. It's time for some new kind of action that will create some sort of new cultural consensus, some new religion, some new something.
Okay.
That because modern Europe is just exhausted and expiring. That's one way of reading him. I don't want to assert all that in my own
apologize.
voice.
I cut you off. You were
It's
talking
okay, it's
about
great.
you were about to talk about postmodernity.
Well, of course, defining postmodernity and whether one can define postmodernity is interesting. The very label suggests it's after whatever's happened in modernity has failed. Whether it's a modern ethical project, a modern project of trying to ground or hold on to knowledge in some crucial way. Certainly, we associate postmodernity with the triumph of perspective over objectivity, with what Lyotard called suspicion of meta-narratives, right? The sense that there's no real unifying story of the world in which everything makes sense and hangs together and has meaning. Instead, there are multiple competing, overlapping stories. And when people talk about my truth or something that's true for me or true for him, that they seem to be indulging this kind of postmodern multiplicity of frameworks. And a lot of that is in Nietzsche. Nietzsche's perspectivism is a major component of that.
That makes it sound very sort of democratic and egalitarian. Like, we all have our own views. It makes atheism feel liberating, like, we don't have to worry about God anymore. It sounds kind of light and happy, and
Right.
we don't have to agree, but at least we'll all get along. Is that would Nietzsche be happy with that version of postmodernity?
I don't think his is much darker, and I think I was thinking when you were speaking there, if you have elements of a syllogism here, right? If you say only God can judge us, and then God is dead, you can draw this sort of comforting conclusion that nobody one is left to judge us. I'm the judge of myself, and so when Dostoevsky said, if God is dead, anything is possible. He didn't mean it as a sort of liberating statement. Right. It was meant to be an observation. It's horrific. It's tragic, and it's also inescapable. Right. So, what is Nietzsche's? We know this from teaching this small passage of Nietzsche as part of the Phil 203 course that Emma has mentioned already in the Mount Core. Part of what's meant by God is dead in the way that Nietzsche presents it is a kind of horrific realization that the thing that we have counted on is not there, right? It's the images that he uses in that passage, right? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the horizon? How are we able to drink up the sea? These are catastrophic, world-ending images, right? The things have come to an end, and we're only just now waking up to it. And so we're like fish, perhaps waking up to discover that the lake is gone, right? And now we're flopping about in the sun. So it's catastrophic, and I think the sort of smile and be happy and live for today, for tomorrow we die, it doesn't seem to fit with the kind of critique that Nietzsche is constructing. And I think that the kind of sensualist's indulgence that would follow from liberation of these things completely misses the point, because Nietzsche is looking for an alternate source of value. I mean, sometimes we'll speak about Nietzsche as being a nihilist, but in many important ways he's an anti-nihilist, or at least he presents himself, maybe half ironically, as an anti-nihilist. He says the trouble with modernity, even the trouble with Platonism, the trouble with Christianity, is that they lead to nihilism. And Nietzsche can say, my Overman philosophy does not need to lead to nihilism. In fact, it may be the last best hope for mankind to avoid a slide into full-on nihilism, death of God, last man, etc.
Okay, so where does he find that alternate meaning?
Well, real basic answer, I think, for Nietzsche, it's in will to power. This is his fundamental idea. One of his fundamental ideas, one of maybe the 5 or 6 key ideas you have to understand if you're going to sort of get a view of Nietzsche, is his view that all life is will to power. It's the will to strive, to overcome, to dominate, to appropriate,
So sheer
to consume.
willpower.
It's willpower, but
not necessarily will to. Like, I know you just used the phrase will to power, but like basically sheer will.
it's will, but he wants to distinguish this from his predecessor Schopenhauer's idea of will, which is a kind of will to nothingness. It's a will to finally the annihilation of the self. So
Okay.
for Nietzsche, it's the will that is expressed in the using of power, like the acquiring and using of power.
Okay.
And it's something like when he says life is will to power, he's almost describing it as kind of the life force. That is what makes living things alive, is they're acting this out. You can, although he's not reacting directly to Darwin, you can sort of contrast this with a Darwinian will to survive or a will to reproduce. Like what really is driving animals? It's the desire to pass on their genes. Not desire, it's the sort of innate need to reproduce and to create the next generation. That's what life is, from bacteria, up through every other kind of animal and every other kind of life. It's us. Nietzsche's candidate for that sort of fundamental life principle is will to power, which is expressed in different ways in human beings and human culture, of course, but which he thinks runs through just about all of the world, all of the living world.
And it's why the death of God doesn't mean the death of judgment, because we can still, we're not just going to sort of happily smile at everybody doing the same old thing. We're going to notice that some people are stronger and better and more effective. Not better morally, but just more capable of discharging their power into the world. And some people don't even have enough power to face the reality of God not existing, and we don't even respect. I mean, I joked before, is he calling forth a democratic vision? He's very anti-democratic.
Absolutely.
He thinks most people don't even have what it takes to face what he's describing, and it's part of what makes reading him exciting. Because if you're like most young people, part of you wants to make yourself worthy of following along, and then a part of you wants to think, do I really want to go down this path? But
right.
Yeah, I mean, he's extremely judgmental, and maybe the judgment is a reflection of the aesthetic perspective that he has. You can definitely decide what is more worth your attention. You can definitely decide what has more power, more beauty, more energy. But why won't he extend that to more goodness? Like why can't we also admire the moral nobility of superior virtue? Why can't we do that?
Boy, so many good questions. Great question. I think I've sort of of two minds about this. I've seen people read Nietzsche as a kind of a latter-day Aristotelian and say he really does. When he praises the Overman, when he praises the man of strong will to power, he's just giving you a version of human excellence. And he's saying, that's the excellent man. Be like that if you can. Most of you can't. But when he starts doing his excellent thing, let him do it. Don't get in his way. And sort of enjoy the sort of cultural sphere that he projects outward from himself. I mean, so this is one way of cashing that out, is that the strong-willed person is a source of value. And I don't mean this in a sort of crude way that he forces others to go along with him. It's that he creates an entire space, like radiating sort of a magnetic field around him, in which lesser beings like you and me can actually find safety and a home. One place I see Nietzschean themes constantly, and this is maybe one hazard of reading Nietzsche, is you begin to see him everywhere. You begin to see will to power sort of coded in different cultural forms. Looking at old westerns, movies. John Wayne, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, one of my favorite westerns. John Wayne and Lee Marvin. They're both Nietzschean overmen, in a sense. They're both morally and sort of in terms of pure, I was going to say willpower, but just pure power, that they're of a totally different order from everyone else in the movie, right? And the future of the town of Shinbone is either going to be with Tom Donovan or with Liberty Valance. It's going to be with the sort of the good strong man, or the evil bad strong man. It's not going to be, it seems, at the beginning at least, with a sort of democratic character of everyone else. So it's the third character. It's Jimmy Stewart's Ransom Stoddard coming into the town that upsets that. But you see the same thing perhaps in other movies, in samurai movies of the post-war period as well. The character who's sort of self-possessed and who creates a kind of world around him that other people want to be part of. I sometimes, in talking about the Overman, want to caution people away from thinking of the Overman, of Nietzsche's ideal of the Overman, purely as a political figure or as a military figure, as someone who just is very muscly and just through brute force imposes his will on the world around him. I think Nietzsche has much in mind a figure of great cultural power, a figure like Shakespeare or Goethe, a figure with a great imagination. So imagine if someone if someone had the skill and the sort of eloquence to create a new cultural form, even a new cultural consensus almost that people would be attracted to. This would be a new source of value in the world. It would be the product of this person's will. Maybe a Van Gogh might be a sort of figure like that, a driven figure who can't be judged by the world's standards because he's creating his own standards. So maybe just a little bit more of a detour into the aesthetic, perhaps.
Just from kind of what you're saying and the way you're describing the Overman, this is sounding a lot like the way you describe Nietzsche. How does he kind of see himself as the first Overman, or because he's driven, he doesn't play by anybody's rules, he has a very high opinion of himself to the point where he can just break down a whole philosophical tradition and create a new one from scratch?
Yeah, he does. Nietzsche himself seems to declaim any identification with the Overman. He's got what I sometimes call a John the Baptist complex, right? He thinks of himself as the precursor of the Overman. I think that's the case both when he writes the Madman passage in the Gay Science, where it's declared that God is dead, and even in some of his later work. I think he is calling people's attention to a figure that's coming. Now, some of that may be ironic, and some of that certainly is calling back to scriptural references and patterns of thought, which may lead us to wonder how enervated and dead are, in fact, these cultural forms, if Nietzsche can sort of get a lot of mileage out of saying, I'm coming to tell you of the one who is coming after me, who is mightier than me. Maybe it's ironic appropriation of a dying culture, or maybe it's an indication that he's tapped into some deep vein of something surviving. So just thinking out loud right now.
It sometimes seems to me that Nietzsche feels himself trapped because he knows that to the extent that he defines himself against other things, he remains subservient to them or trapped by them, and that what he really needs to do is find a way to do what he's doing without it being a criticism of other philosophers or without it being a criticism of Christianity, or he has to stop caring about those things. But of course, this is why he can't be the Overman, but can only be the prophet, the John the Baptist of the Overman.
Yeah.
Because he cares too much?
Well, because he can only describe what someone would be like if they were truly free, if they could truly chart their own path. And yet, here he is, a German scholar trained in language and writing books for a writing public, who he knows are enmeshed in the very culture that he's criticizing. And
right. I sometimes wonder, if we could have gotten Nietzsche an extra 30 years of life, if he hadn't died young, if he'd lived to be the age that John Dewey lived to, he would have lived into the late 30s and seen the rise of Hitler, and it would have been interesting to see what he would have thought of that a time period and movement. As it is, things turned out differently, but I sometimes wonder if Nietzsche might not have followed a path similar to that of Coleridge, who starts out as a kind of youthful radical and ends up as a kind of more conservative cultural commentator towards the end of his life. Nietzsche, I think, somewhere, not in Twilight, talks about the difference, the transition between his no-saying project and his yes-saying project. So there's a point at which he's done with critique, or he's completed his critique. It's a critique of Schopenhauer, it's a critique of Kant, it's a critique of Christianity generally. Now, I think a lot of that remains in the rest of his work, but he moves on to a yes-saying moment. And part of the trouble with Nietzsche, I've already distinguished between his critical project and his sort of prescriptive, affirmative project. Some of the stuff from the affirmative project looks kind of wacky, right? Like eternal recurrence. I shouldn't say wacky on a podcast like this, but it's tough. It's tough. It's tough to take eternal recurrence as seriously as Nietzsche seemed to take it. But he insisted, throughout his life that after he realized it, this was the key to his entire thought. And some people will leave it out when teaching him because it seems the idea that time is circular and will repeat endlessly seems unnecessary to understand the rest of his system. And yet for him, it seems personally to him to be very important. And of course, there are any number of other things about will to power and the Overman that we would find objectionable. But it seems to me that the quality of his substitute or his proposal for postmodernity may not match up with the quality and acuteness and subtlety of his diagnostic skill in recognizing the problems of modernity and where they're likely to lead. So his skill as a psychologist, I think, is very high. His skill as a sort of speculative philosopher or prophet of the future, maybe a little bit more uncertain.
Are we ready to ask the practical question, like advice for readers, or do you have another question?
I don't have another question explicitly, but I think we have time to tease out one more implication. It's
Do it.
quite a large book. Oh Lord.
Well, the book is only about 100 pages long. It's
okay. It looks bigger.
What I have here, what I brought is the portable Nietzsche. This is a bunch of books together.
Okay.
So the Twilight of the Idols itself is about 100 pages. It's not overwhelming.
That's not bad at all.
No. You guys want one more point? Let me read
Yes.
something from his
Yes,
critique
please.
of
Thank you.
education because
We have to have some actual.
there's a point. He's in some ways, it would be nice to know just what he'd make of the age of social media, because I think he would either be, one of the best users of Twitter and Instagram ever, or he would completely flee from it and say it's utterly worthless.
He'd block a lot of people.
He would certainly have blocked a lot of people. Yes.
Or he'd be mistweeted, if that's a thing. Misquoted.
Mistweeting, misquoting. Yeah, there's a passage in here, one of my favorites in Nietzsche, in Twilight of the Idols, in the section "What the Germans Lack," and one of the things the Germans lack is a decent education system. So he gets a bit fiery and polemical here, but we may just enjoy it.
Let's
for
hear it.
that perspective. The entire system of higher education in Germany has lost what matters most, the end as well as the means to the end. That education, that Bildung, is itself an end and not the Reich, and that educators are needed to that end and not secondary school teachers and university scholars, that has been forgotten. Educators are needed who have themselves been educated, superior, noble spirits proved at every moment, proved by words and silence, representing culture which has grown ripe and sweet, not the learned louts whom secondary schools and universities today offer our youth as higher wet nurses. Educators are lacking, not counting the most exceptional of exceptions, the very first condition of education, hence the decline of German culture. Skipping a sentence. What the higher schools in Germany really achieve is a brutal training designed to prepare huge numbers of young men with as little loss of time as possible to become usable, abusable in government service. Higher education and huge numbers, that is a contradiction to start with. All higher education belongs only to the exception. One must be privileged to have a right to so high a privilege. He criticizes later in the paragraph the democratization of Bildung has become common, all too common. So there are some other things in there.
From what you read, there's so many Nietzschean themes. The kind of elitism or aristocracy. This isn't for everybody. The disdain for certain kinds of modern institutions. The respect for real learning that shows a kind of investment of the whole soul in contact with reality, as opposed to something that passes for learning, which is just a superficial training.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people would share those views without having read Nietzsche or realizing that they're embodying a Nietzschean spirit. We're still struggling with that. You could read a newspaper editorial today criticizing higher education exactly the same way.
Mm-hmm. And it honestly, this reminds me of a meme I saw on Facebook. It was critiquing the current higher education system. So you get a degree to get a job to pay back the loans that you took out to get that piece of paper. And like as you were reading that made me think of getting a degree to get a job to pay back your degree.
Well, part of what he's attacking is the idea in his own place and time in Bismarck's Prussia that education is now for the service of the state or of the economy, right, of the nation. So we need a sort of pipeline of people from the raw material, of youth, with its, callow playfulness to, being, serious, getting a job, doing business, generating money
Tool them up to serve the state.
Right, tools to serve the state. Now, saying to serve the state, to serve the Reich, that's a very disturbing expression in light of 20th century history, obviously. But even just talk about making education serve the economy or serve the public weal. That seems to conflict with the ideal that Nietzsche's at least gesturing at here. And the key element of it that I read there was the need for educators of a certain sort. The need for a certain type of person, a whole person, but a certain type of person who is able to mediate these cultural forms and knowledge and initiation, almost you want to say into a tradition of thought and of reasoning to new members of that group. The idea of a sort of factory model of producing people who now can function well, whether they're self-directed or directed by the political authorities. All of that, he seems to say, is betraying this more humanistic model. So I don't want to read too much into just what's one passage, but he's concerned about the state of German university education, and to the extent that that's spread and has come to dominate, at least formally speaking, much of education in much of the rest of the world, that critique may strike not just at his own place and time.
I'd like to, think of a flattering perspective from Mount St. Mary's and think that maybe Nietzsche would admire we're doing something a little bit countercultural. But it also strikes me that Nietzsche's critique would be hard to fit into standard political or ideological categories. I mean, is that a conservative critique or a liberal critique? The question doesn't even make sense in a way. It's standing outside of that and just sort of pointing to the system, and you could imagine people from any perspective realizing, yeah, we need institutions that are dedicated to true learning and not just turning people into parts of a larger inhumane machine.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think there's a lot in there, because there's elitism, there's a sort of anti-democratic spirit that education should be just for the few who can really appreciate it. Not all of those things can really be brought forward to our context. But I think he's one of these thinkers that seems to transcend easy categorization, and that may mean that he's dealing with things on a different sort of level. So we need to leave some of these old categories behind and begin seeing the world that he's critiquing the way that he's seen it, and then ask ourselves whether he's seen it correctly.
All right, well, now I think we can get to the little practical application-ish. So you said Twilight of the Idols is a good introduction to his work. Do you have a particular translation that you recommend, or any other books that, if it's only 100 pages, do you have anything else that could pair well with it to get started?
Oh, boy. Well, this is just my prejudice. I read Nietzsche in English the first time in the translations of Walter Kaufmann. And I think that's a good solid translation. There have been some since then, but Kaufmann's maybe the first translator in the 1960s to really, I think, try to get Nietzsche right from the original German sources. There was some trouble with some corruption of his texts and introduction of edits after he went insane and after his death by family members and followers of his. H.L. Mencken did, I think, a relatively poor translation, edition of Nietzsche's works in the 1920s that sort of dogs his reputation. So it's may not be until the 1960s and 70s that we really have good translations. But your practical question, Walter Kaufmann, Kaufmann with a K and two N's at the end, his translations are good overall. In addition to reading Twilight, if you wanted to try reading Beyond Good and Evil, the book that Dr. Hochschild referred to earlier, that's fairly straightforward. Not straightforward. It's a fairly revealing work of Nietzsche's, including again the interesting title, right? Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be beyond good and evil? In what way are some people, or perhaps all people now, beyond the categories of good and evil, and what categories would they use instead? So that's an interesting book, and one that I think can repay reading even for a beginning reader.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation.
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Really fun.